Hi everyone and welcome to the Warwick Classics Network, a teachers event for November 2020. Thank you so much indeed for your patience in the organisation of this event, as well as kind of being willing to engage with it online. It is hugely appreciated and we're so glad that we're able to bring this event to you today. So my job for the next half hour or so is to give you a little bit of material to get thinking about one of the topics for the OCR Classical Civilisation syllabus, which is going to be democracy and imperialism, part of the beliefs and ideas section of the curriculum. And what I wanted to focus on particularly was the topic of Solon. So the first topic that is set out as part of the areas of study, but one which I think is badly served by the prescribed texts, none of which really relate to the period in question. And I think it leaves us with a bit of a gap for how do we help students study and understand this period. So what I want to go through with you today is a few of the things that I use to help teach this period, particularly to my students when I'm running my democracy and imperialism module, and offer you some texts which hopefully will be of help to you as you go through your teaching of it. Now, some of these may well be familiar to you, some hopefully new to you, and as a result to give you the opportunity to widen out the scope of how you teach this particular early and important period in Athens' development story. So I wanted to begin with a text that actually might be useful for you when you're teaching any aspect of democracy and the Athenians. And this is a sort of overview, if you will, offered to us by Aristotle in his Constitution of the Athenians, or Athpol, in section 41. In the list of reforms, this was the 11th in number. Aristotle is coming out of discussing the last, his 11th, the last of the major political reforms in Athens' constitution. And then he goes back to start at the beginning. There first occurred the organisation of the original constitution after the settlement at Athens of Ion and his companions. For it was then that the people were first divided into the 4 tribes and appointed the tribal kings. So this is the first constitution of Athens. The second constitution, and the first subsequent one that involved a constitutional point, by this I think he means a kind of actual setup of laws, was the reforms that took place in the time of Theseus, which was a slight divergence from the royal constitution. After that one came the reform in the time of Draco, in which a code of laws was first published. Third was the one that followed the civil disturbance in the time of Solon, from which democracy took its beginning. Now, I find this paragraph quite difficult to understand in many ways, not least because how Aristotle's actually doing his counting. If the first constitution is at Athens at the time of Ion and his companions, the second constitution came at the time of Theseus, but then there were reforms in the time of Draco, but that doesn't seem to be counted as a sort of technical change point in the set of reforms that Aristotle is listing, because he goes on to say the third one was kind of in the time of Solon. So we seem to have here with Aristotle, he's sort of adjudicating different levels of change. And for him, laws of Draco, the draconian laws that came into force in Athens at the end of the 7th century in response, we think, to severe political unrest, and indeed that was spilling out into kind of action, murder on the streets, which the draconian laws of Draco were supposed to address, don't qualify in Aristotle's view as a sort of new turning point in the constitution. They're talked about as reforms, but not necessarily as a turning point in the constitution. But then very much Solon is. And it's interesting that Aristotle will attribute to this point, to Solon's reforms, the point from which democracy took its beginning. And of course, one of the most important things you'll be thinking about with your class is to what extent are Solon's reforms in any way can be described as democratic in terms of what he was intending to do, in terms of what their effects were, and then of course in terms of how they were later understood and thought about by later Athenian writers. So Aristotle then goes on, and this is where it's quite interesting for you to keep referring back to this kind of useful roadmap, if you like, through your course with your students. Fourth was the tyranny in the time of Pisistratus, and I note that this is not actually an official section kind of in the syllabus that you have to teach in Democracy and the Athenians. It goes straight from Solon down to Cleisthenes, but actually I think this is missing out a very important element and aspect of Athenian development, which is under the time of Pisistratus, and clearly Aristotle thought it was as well, because it gets a fourth turning point. Fifth, the constitution of Cleisthenes. We're back into our kind of more normal narrative, following the deposition of the tyrants, which was more democratic than the constitution of Solon. Now, interestingly, again, there, how he's comparing, contrasting, and setting up the narrative arc here. We had reforms of Solon, from which democracy took its beginning. Then there was a sort of interregnum, if you like, a change in the constitution with the tyranny in the time of Pisistratus, and then we get back to Cleisthenes, which was more democratic than the constitution of Solon, but linked back to Solon, as if the narrative has got back on track and has advanced towards the democracy that we know Athens will become under Cleisthenes. Sixth, the reform after the Persian Wars under the Council of the Areopagus. Seventh, followed the reform outlined by Aristides but completed by Ephialtes when he put down the Areopagitic Council, which was in the 460s BC, during which it came about because of the demagogues that the state made many mistakes because of the empire of the sea. Now we've got, so that was seventh, then eighth was the establishment of the 400, and after that ninth, democracy again. So again, this sort of narrative of democracy coming and going and linking those moments of democracy, Solon to Cleisthenes to the points 6 and 7, but then 8 was definitely not, 9 was back to democracy again, 10th was the tyranny of the 30, so again back to tyranny, and then 11th was the constitution established after the return from Phyle and from Piraeus, from which dates the constitution has continued down to its present form, constantly taking on additions to the power of the multitude. For the people has made itself master of everything and administers everything by decrees and by jury courts, in which the people is the ruling power, for even the cases tried by the council have come to the people. So we can see Aristotle here offering us a useful narrative arc. We may want to disagree with it. We may want to disagree with what he considers to be a turning point that deserves a number, as opposed to just a series of reforms. We may want to disagree with whether or not his characterization of particular reforms as democratic, more democratic, tyrannical. And it's also interesting to note here, narrative arc, how things speed up. So we have sort of the first turning point of the constitution back at the very foundation of Athens and the Athenian people. Then we move to Theseus. Then we come to Draco again to late 7th century, then to Solon early 6th century, then to Pisistratus mid 6th century, then to Cleisthenes end 6th century. So we've got sort of 3 turning points in the 6th century, and then you've got the reform after the Persian Wars, number 6. You've got the 7th reforms of Ephialtes. You've got the establishment of the tyranny of the 400 and the 410. You've got democracy being re-established, and you've got the tyranny of the 30 in 4043, and then the 11th, the re-establishment of the constitution after that. So in the 5th century, you've got reforms 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And 11. So you've got sort of 3 sets of reforms in the 6th century, and then 6 massive changes for Aristotle, all contained within the 5th century, after which he says there are no more major changes, although of course different additions keep being made. So there really is a sort of focus in Aristotle's narrative here on kind of how things speed up as we get to the 5th century. But how do we talk about Solon? Now, you will have your ways of teaching the kind of reforms that he is supposed to have put forward, the changes he made. I don't really want to focus so much on those, but what I do want to focus on is offering students a way of understanding a little bit of how we can know something about Solon, because we're dealing with a period of history here where, in terms of literary sources, we actually are really strapped for cash, and that's not only in the syllabus specified classifications for classical civilization. It's actually in the form that we have very little contemporary evidence for what's going on in Athens at this time in the literary material. What we are left with is actually looking at a number of the later sources and pulling out of those things, those later sources, two different things. We can pull out how those later writers talk about this historical period and what they say about it, but we can also pull out a number of specific details of Solon as an individual, and more importantly, we can actually pull out a great deal of his own poetry. And it's his own poetry that I actually want to go on and focus on and give you a few examples of in the rest of this talk. But to begin with, what do we know about Solon? So here we might look at Aristotle's Athpol, Constitution of the Athenians, sections 5 to 12. We might look at Plutarch's Life of Solon to give us a sense of who this person was. And this is just an example from Aristotle's Athpol, sections 5 to 6. Such being the system in the Constitution, and the many being enslaved to the few, this is him setting up the situation as we come into the period of Solon's reforms in 590-43. The people rose against the notables. So it really does set this up as a democratic rising up of the mass of the people. The party struggle being violent and the parties remaining arrayed in opposition to one another for a long time. They jointly chose Solon as arbiter and archon and entrusted the government to him after he had composed the elegy that begins, I mark, and sorrow fills my breast to see Ionia's oldest land being done to death. So again, in this passage, we can see how not only is Aristotle telling this as a story of the rising up of the multitude, but equally putting up Solon as the kind of only character that everyone agrees, whatever side of the spectrum you're on, everyone agrees is the suitable candidate to become an arbitrator and an archon, trusted the entire government to him. And particularly, Aristotle associates that trust coming from the fact that he composed these great and meaningful poetical works, which really seem to have pulled at the heartstrings of all Athenians. And Aristotle goes on to say, Solon was by birth and reputation of the first rank, so he is definitely an aristocrat, one of the elites, but by wealth and position belonged to the middle class. So he's a sort of faded elite, if you like, as is admitted on the part of the other authorities. And as he himself testifies in these poems, exhorting the wealthy not to be covetous. And again, you see Aristotle's bringing in the fact that Solon seems to have done a lot of his kind of communicating in part through his use of elegiac verse. Refrain ye in your hearts those stubborn moods, plunged in a surfeit of abundant goods, and moderate your pride. Will not submit, nor even you yourselves will this befit. And so it goes on. So we're going to go and have a look now at some of the fragments that are surviving of Solon's poetry as they've been pulled out of the later authors. And these fragments of poetry are our only contemporary literary evidence for what is going on in Athens at this time during the reforms of Solon. Now, it'd be useful, I think, to have some discussion with your students about what that means in terms of how we can use these sources, care we need to apply with using these sources to understand what's going on. Not only are they being pulled out of much later sources, so how do those later writers know exactly what has been said by Solon some 100, 200 plus years later? But equally, if we're relying on Solon's own voice and own understanding of what he thinks he's doing and what he's achieving, then obviously we've got a very single viewpoint from which to understand the bigger game afoot. So let's have a look at Solon in his own words here. This is fragment 4, and I'll show you where you can go if you want to access more of the fragments of Solon's poetry when we get to the end of this section. But to destroy a great city by their thoughtlessness is the wish of the citizens won over by money. And unrighteous is the mind of the people's leaders, who are about to suffer many pains for their great arrogance. In the Greek here, the word is hubris, so we can set up an excellent way in which Solon is seeing himself as the act of nemesis coming back, the vengeance of the gods on the pride and arrogance of the people. Solon is almost the kind of will and weapon of the gods in this way. This is an inescapable wound which comes to every city and swiftly brings it to wretched slavery, arousing civil discord and slumbering war, which has destroyed the lovely prime of many. Thus the public evil comes to each at home, and house doors can no longer keep it out. It has leapt over high fences, found people in all ways, even one who runs and hides in the furthest corner of a room. So what we've got here is Solon setting up kind of what he sees is the problem that he's been brought in to address. There is huge thoughtlessness. Citizens have been won over by money, by greed. Unrighteousness is rife. Hubris is being committed on every side. This is a wound that comes to every city, right, and brings with it wretched slavery, civil discord, slumbering war, destroyed the prime, the kind of life of many. And the fact is, this has not just touched a few people, but this has actually touched everyone. Right? We've got to a point now in Athens, Solon is arguing here, where the public evil comes to every home and house doors. You can't even keep it out from your own home. It's infiltrated, infected even individual families. It's leapt over high fences. There's no kind of barrier you can put in the way. Even if you run away from it, you are now affected by it, setting up just quite how dramatically this period has brought instability and difficulty to Athens. He goes on in his fragment 5.1 to talk about what he thought he did. Now, obviously, you'll be able to talk with your students about the elements of what he did. And then, of course, you need to think about how to understand those elements. And particularly, I think it's useful to think about them. To what extent do you agree with the idea that Aristotle put forward in his section 41 of the Constitution of the Athenians, that this is the beginning of the democratic constitution? To what extent can we see anything in Solon's reforms that we would want to, or the Athenians would want to describe as democracy? Now, in his own poetry, he says, to the demos, the people, I have given such honour as is sufficient, neither taking away nor granting any more. For those who had power and were great in riches, I equally cared that they should suffer nothing wrong. Thus I stood, holding my strong shield over both, and I did not allow either side to prevail against justice. Now, in this sense, the demos does seem to refer to the more wider mass of the people, the kind of lower classes of kind of Solon's renegotiation of the classes, so perhaps the Zeugetai and the Thetes. And he's comparing them against those who had power and great riches, so perhaps the Pentecostodumnoi and the Hippies. But what he's saying is, I gave them such honour as is sufficient. He's not saying that he gave them all power, neither taking away nor granting any more. And for those who had power, of course, that they should suffer nothing wrong. And thus he sets himself up as this independent arbitrator who's got his strong shield overseeing both sides, allowing neither to prevail against justice. Now, this sounds all very good, but you might want to think with your students about, okay, well, who decides what and how much honour is sufficient here? Who decides what actually is the definition of justice, which Solon is seeing as his arbiter of what each should get? It's actually very much up to Solon, it seems, how he sees where justice lies, as to then how much he gives to each section of the community. And don't forget that most of the descriptions of this period talk about a eunomia, so nomia, law, order, custom, good, so good order, good law. They don't talk about what we will later come on to identify and associate with the democracy of Athens, isonomia, so iso, equal, nomia, law, custom, so equality before the law. This is about good order, not necessarily equal order. And so again, wrapped up in good order, of course, is, well, what does good order mean to you, or particularly to Solon? And then in his fragment 34 of his own poetry, here's another kind of really important aspect of how Solon has portrayed himself. Others came for plunder, They had hopes of wealth, each one of them thinking that he would find much prosperity and that I, for all my gentle prattle, would reveal a harsh disposition. They had foolish thoughts then, and now they are angry and they all look askance at me as if I were their enemy. They should not. With the help of the gods, I have accomplished what I said I would, and other fruitless measures I did not take. It gives me no pleasure to act with the violence of tyranny or to share the country's rich land equally between the lower and upper classes. So again, setting out the fact that people were thinking, oh, this is just going to be, he's just going to be a gentle prattler. But now they're actually quite angry at him because he seems to have done something. But kind of he's making it very clear he didn't want to be a tyrant. And he didn't want to share the country's rich land, but equally between the lower and the upper classes. This was not about equality. This was about good order and a slight readjustment. And then he moves on into fragment 35, and he talks about the fact what he considers he has done. I did this by harnessing force and justice together with power. And again, we might have to think about, well, who's defining justice here? And I carried through my promises. I wrote statutes alike for those of high and low social status, fitting straight justice to each. Again, whose justice? How are we defining it? If someone other than I had taken power, some ill-intentioned and greedy man, he would not have been able to control the people. For had I been willing to do what pleased the opposing party then, or what the others had planned for them, this city would have lost many men. That is why I made a stout defence all around, turning like a wolf among many hounds, setting himself up as someone who's simultaneously got that strong shield over all people, all parties, but equally having to defend himself continually from others who wanted him to do different things. He had to be the wolf among hounds, as well as the shepherd of the flock, as well as the protector of the flock, at the same time putting forward his plan, which of course depends entirely on what his definition of justice really is. So if you want to have a look at more of Solon's fragments or introduce them into your teaching, I would recommend going to the Loeb edition of Greek elegiac poetry. And in there is the collected fragments of Solon's poetry. And it shows you which kind of later authors they're picked out of and gives you the references for them as well. So you can have a look at a number of different fragments that you could bring into your teaching. And they reflect on different aspects of what Solon was interested in, his reforms, but equally his military record, particularly thinking of Salamis, and also go on to think a little bit about what else he did and where else he went after his reforms. And this is perhaps the other aspect of the Solon part of the democracy and the Athenians syllabus that I'd like to focus on. The impact afterwards, not just of Solon's reforms, but actually of Solon and how he's considered at different points in time. And just to give you a few outlines for this, thoughts on Solon's reforms. It's interesting that in the 5th century BC, that period of dramatic change when the next 6 of Aristotle's changes of the constitutions are happening, actually Solon is not somebody that they are constantly looking back to, referring to, thinking about as the origins of their democracy, as we saw Aristotle will go on to do in the 4th century. If you look at Herodotus, for instance, he's much more focused on Solon's travels once he's left Athens. So Solon leaves for a period of 10 years, and we'll see a quote about this in a second, and comes across this Croesus of Lydia. So this is an absolutely fantastic story for Herodotus. And you can see the reference there. After establishing new laws for the citizens at their request, he spent 10 years traveling abroad, admittedly because he wanted to see the world, but really because he did not want to be forced to revoke any of his laws. So we see Solon talked about as having kind of established new laws, but not really in terms of the kind of father or progenitor of democracy in any way. Thucydides doesn't mention him. Solon is not a character that he's interested in. And if we look into comedy, we can see in Aristophanes' Clouds, performed in 423, Solon does come up briefly as a figure, again, associated very much just with establishing laws. And they quote him like this: our ancient Solon was by nature a friend of the people, not being set up as a hero of the democracy in any major way. Yet if we turn to the 4th century, so after we've had the last of Aristotle's changes in the constitution in 403, and when we start to have that whole bevy of both legal speechwriters, orators and philosophers who are thinking a lot about kind of the kind of legacy and creation of Athens' democracy after it's had its turbulent 5th century, after the loss of empire, as Athens is fighting for its position and livelihood within a very fast changing world of 4th century Greece. It's at this point that Solon starts to become a much more important figure. Demosthenes, for instance, on the Crown, says Solon, the man who first established the laws, in contrast to Aristotle, obviously, who said that there were laws happening before the time of Solon, was a friend of the people. You get that kind of that tone coming up again that we saw in Aristophanes, and a genuine democrat. And this is interesting that he's now being seen as a genuine democrat, whereas actually when we look at his own poetry, we might want to question that as an attribution and think about him as coming up with his own version of justice, which really was about eunomia, as we've said, not isonomia, and certainly not democratia. He thought that the laws should be sovereign because they were written and because the jurors had to swear on them. So very much still attracting the focus to the kind of the primacy of the law, which you might expect in a speech, kind of put forward an oratorical legal speech. Hyperides, again, kind of a law court speech against Athenoges. Solon, that most democratic man, absolutely kind of a crucial point being put forward here in now, not just a genuine democrat, but the most democratic man. And we see this coming through in Aristotle's Athpol, his constitution at the Athenians as well. So we've seen it a little bit in that section 41 that we began with, that association of the beginnings of democracy with the reforms of Solon. But we see it in some of his descriptions of Solon as well. He was the people's champion. Solon set the people free for the present and for the future. In those different sections you can see there. Now, I don't think we should make it out that in the 4th century, Solon kind of is said to have solved all problems, because obviously very clearly it comes through in the 4th century text, particularly in Aristotle, and that there will be very quickly further changes after Solon to the constitution, particularly the tyranny of
Break it